So, good evening to each one of you, and a very warm welcome to this masterclass on financial statement analysis, which is one of the most important skills that each one of you must have, especially if you want to enter a role in finance or become a financial analyst. So, let us start with a quotation that, I truly believe in. Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world, isn't it? So, well, let's try to imbibe this feeling of, trying to learn something new every day. And let's finally begin with this masterclass on the financial statement analysis. So, let me quickly walk you through the contents of the course of the session, and let's discuss how are we going to proceed with it and what you can expect out of it. So we'll start with a basic introduction where we'll, talk about the accounting process, the accounting rules, what standards govern the preparation of the financial statements eventually, and, what is the entire process that leads to bookkeeping and finally preparing the financial statements. We'll also be talking about, the various financial statements because they form the basis of analysis, right? Then in the next module, we'll obviously be talking about the typical structure of all the major financial statements, the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flow. We'll see, what are the various tools, the various approaches that we follow to analyze any company's financials. We'll also try and see कि companies की interlinking कैसे होती है. You should be aware of the fact that, how is one statement connected to the other and how do we all work around this? Because in the future, when you start with financial statements, you should be able to analyze an entire company and rather an industry. So in order to do that, we always start with the basics of understanding what our financial statements hold, what are the various components, how do we calculate the trend analysis, how do we see if every component is more or less as compared to the revenue. So we'll be talking about those things, and obviously, because I believe that learning should always be backed by some practical exposure and knowledge. So we'll also be looking at one case study from an Indian IT company. We'll work around the financials of those companies. And then again, I will expect that all of you attending this masterclass will be in a position to carry out or, at least use all the tools and approaches we teach you as a part of this. But the question still remains the same. Why are we attending this? Why are we doing it? Probably to get a good job, right? Or maybe to switch to finance and to move in areas where I'll be able to use my analysis in the finance domain. Hence, we'll also be talking about, what kind of interview questions and the specific answers that you can form as a part of those questions and what the recruiters expect primarily from this topic. So let us begin with the first introduction phase where, we'll be talking about the accounting standards. So I think this particular slide that you can see on the screen, right? This takes us back to our, BCom days, or I would say if you've done BBA, BCom, or are you a BCom honors graduate, anything or whatever you've done, I'm sure that this is something that seems very logical, right? So अगर मैं आपसे पूछूं that accounting process क्या है, or what is rather accounting, right? So I'll just be speaking of a definition which I'm sure आप लोगों ने कहीं ना कहीं सुनी होगी. Accounting is the process of identification, classification, summarizing and analyzing, and finally communicating and interpreting the results to the end users. So here I'm talking about a lot of factors, but then I am talking about following a chronological order and eventually communicating our analysis to the end users. Who are the end users? They could be people sitting inside the organization, they are who are interested in the day-to-day decision making of the business. They could be people who are sitting outside and have a financial or an operational interest in the business. Well, to limit our analysis, to limit our study to the financial statements, I'll quickly walk you through the accounting process in brief. So as you guys know that, the bookkeeping process ends, and that is when we start preparing the financial statements. So the analysis part starts once we have the financial statements ready. We always start with identifying the transactions of a business. Let's say that, there was a promoter or a person who started a business. He would need some capital to start that particular venture, right? So identifying in a chronological order or in the order in which the transactions have occurred, that what are those financial or the monetary transactions that lead to either a revenue and expense, a liability, an asset, an income, or a loss. So we try to identify these areas and we prepare the book of original entry or the journal, right? But the journal or I would say अगर हम financials हम अपने transactions को एक chronological order में record कर रहे हैं, so it should also be backed by some evidences. So when I say evidences, I mean the invoices, the receipts, the bank statements, the purchase orders. So any or every organization has some sort of an evidence in the form of, they might have purchase orders, or they might have buy orders, sell orders, credit notes, debit notes, invoices, which accounts to their sales and purchases. So they act as a source document. Once you have the source document, you start preparing or recording the transactions in a book called ledger. In the book called journal. Journal is also called the book of original entry, because that is the first step towards which you record the financials, you record the transactions in a chronological order. Once the journal is prepared, then we move to preparing the ledger and the trial balance. So what is a ledger? Ledger is the account-wise summary of all the transactions that have occurred related to that particular account. So if I say a bank account ledger, I mean all the debit and credits that have happened with respect to the bank. So I maintain all those accounts and summarize the transactions in individual accounts. Then I prepare a trial balance, which is simply the debits is equals to the credits. That is, all the debits and all the credits are maintained in the form of a table, and we create a list of all the accounts. And it is very important that we follow a double entry system of accounting, which means that the sum of all the debit entries should be equal to the sum of the credit entries. Now that we have studied a bit about the accounting process, we know that we start with preparing the financial statements. Now let me ask you that what are the various financial statements? Well, I'm sure we have heard of the income statement, which is also called the profit and loss account. We prepare the balance sheet, we prepare the cash flow statement. These financials are publicly available for the public limited companies. The private limited companies are not authorized in their books to publish these accounts to the public. However, if they plan to go public, or if they plan to launch an IPO, they are supposed to communicate the same to the end users or to the investors in the form of quarterly and annual reports. So the entire accounting process ends when we finally interpret and analyze the financial information and make it available to the end users. Now, moving ahead. Well, we should also be aware, before we understand कि हमारे financial statements prepare कैसे होते हैं, we should also know what accounting standards in India governs the preparation of those accounts, right? So in India, the accounting standards are majorly issued by the Accounting Standards Board, which is under the leadership or the purview of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. The Accounting Standard Board is primarily responsible for formulating and issuing the accounting standards जो हर corporate entity को follow करना होगा while preparing their financial statements. Now, why do you think these statements are needed? These statements are needed so that एक uniformity, एक consistency and एक transparency रहे in financial reporting. Imagine a scenario in which हर company अपने खुद के standards use कर रही है. A few companies in the same industry are using, let's say, one method of depreciation. Some are using a separate method of depreciation, and as a result, the net profit that we arrive in the income statement is not comparable. Hence, to avoid such errors and to avoid the temporary differences and errors that arise out of these practices, we have followed a standard accounting process in India. India adopted the Indian accounting standard for certain class of companies, while some of the companies also follow the accounting standards which are issued by ICAI, that is the Chartered Accountants of India Institute. Now let us try and study more of what these companies are that follow the Indian accounting standard and which ones follow the accounting standards. So more than 80-90% of the companies which are listed or rather public would follow the Indian accounting standards, which means that they would follow the standards as per the IFRS. Hence, a good understanding of IFRS helps you fetch a better role. So nowadays, the companies that are recruiting or any organization, or you might see in a lot of JDs that it is mentioned that, you need to have a good understanding of IFRS. Why is that so? Because that is a primary requirement through which any company, any listed company in India would prepare their financials. So the Indian accounting standard is based on the IFRS and is applicable to, again, as I said, to a major chunk of companies operating in the Indian context. And this is mandated by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, MCA. However, the accounting standards that we talked about in the last slide, they are under the purview of ICAI, right? These standards, they were formulated, before the Indian accounting standards were formulated, and they largely align with the generally accepted accounting standards or GAP. Well, this is something, this is an area that you can go and explore more if you really want to enter into tax roles, because if you want to make a career in tax or assurance, these kind of standards and areas are tested more often. But if you want to enter into finance, yes, a very basic understanding of what we discussed is more than enough for you to at least crack the interviews. Now let's, we know that, right? I just spoke about the Indian accounting standards and I said that most of the listed companies follow this. But what then is followed by other companies? As I said, the accounting standards are followed by the small and medium sized companies, the non-listed companies, the companies which have a net worth below the Indian accounting standard threshold. So if you go to Google and simply type that what is the Indian accounting threshold, you will be able to find the answer. So do some sort of analysis, go beyond, and try to find answers to these questions. The non-corporate entities. Now, what are these entities? These entities are those companies, they are not the companies, but they follow Indian GAAP. So basically, they are the companies such as, the partnership entities, the LLPs, the proprietors, the NPOs, which does not fall under the scope of corporates which are listed under the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Well, do not get confused among these standards, because they would be more tested from a perspective, if you are entering into tax and audit roles, as I said. But a basic understanding of the difference between accounting AS and AS is very much needed for all the accounting and finance graduates, right? Okay, so let's move ahead and let's see what else can we study in this.